The movie The Killing Fields is the true story of a New York Times reporter who was working in Cambodia during the time of awful bloodshed. His closest assistant was a Cambodian who was later captured by a totalitarian group known for its torturous cruelty. What the Cambodian assistant endured while trying to find freedom is beyond belief. It isn't a movie for the squeamish. There are things this assistant sees and endures that defies imagination. He's brutally beaten, imprisoned, mistreated, starving. He lives in the worst possible conditions. At long last, he plans his escape. He runs from one tragic scene to another. And finally, having endured the rigors of the jungle while being chased by his captors, he steps out into a clearing and looks down. And to his utter amazement, he sees the Cambodian border. Down below him is a small refugee camp. His eyes catch the sight of a hospital and a flag. And on that flag is a cross. There at long last, hope is awakened, and at that point the music builds to a climax. Light returns to his weary face, which says in a dozen different ways, I'm free. I'm free. And the joys and the delights of his long-awaited freedom are his. And ultimately he makes it to America, and he enjoys a tearful reunion with his friend, all because he's free, free at last. What does it mean to you to be free? For some people it means the avoidance of all responsibility, the elimination of all constraints, to do one's own thing without any regard for the effect on others or society at large. So we harass the new groom and we say his freedom is over. Stressed out parents dream of the day when the last chick is flown from the nest. Taxpayers curse the IRS. The weary homeowner dreams of retiring to a condo with no grass to mow and snow to shovel. Freedom, we say to ourselves, is the absence of responsibility. But deep in our hearts, we all know that that's a lie. For true freedom is not the absence of responsibility. Such freedom would actually be hell. We only have to look about our society to see what freedom from responsibility has done to many people. Quickly we observe moral bankruptcy and monumental misery. True freedom is always yoked to responsibility. Stephen Mosley, in his book, There I Go Again, gives a classic example of this truth. In 1980, Peru was struggling to make its way out of the 12 years of dictatorship and toward full democracy. An engineering consultant named Hernando de Soto began to study two communities that stood on opposite banks of Lima's Rimac River. He was interested in them because they were located quite close together, and yet they were strikingly and markedly different. In one, the majority of the dwellings were crude huts, cardboard, plywood, and yet the residents were not exactly destitute. De Soto noticed there were a lot of refrigerators and modern appliances visible through most open doorways and television antennas, and were sprouting from almost all the shacks, so they had things. But across the river, in the other community, there were attractive 3- and 4-story brick homes bordered by tiny gardens and paved sidewalks, and this was what dominated the scene. Many of the residents were merchants who lived above thriving businesses, which might have been a pharmacy or a grocery, or a tire shop or a shoe store. De Soto began asking, why do some people prosper and others languish? So he began talking to both residents and local authorities of these two communities. And to his surprise, he discovered that these two communities had almost identical beginnings, that they had been founded at the same time by Indian migrants who had come from the same area, even the same villages. In fact, brothers were living across the river from each other. So how do you explain their vast economic differences? The usual answers wouldn't do. Both communities had the same cultural background. Both had been settled by migrants claiming squatters' rights over public lands. So if foreign or local exploitation was involved, both seemed equally vulnerable to it. But finally, DeSoto tracked down a retired housing ministry official who had seen the two neighborhoods develop for decades. And he told DeSoto that for 6 long years, the elected leader of the more prosperous neighborhood had lobbied and pled with Lina's politicians until they granted land titles to the residents of that community. Once secure from eviction, homeowners began to borrow, sweat, and save until they could improve their dwellings. And in 10 years, their homes had increased in a value of a phenomenal 41 times. So residences in the community across the river, however, they remained only squatters. They couldn't add rooms or sell property or to borrow money or to set up businesses. So logically enough, they spent their money on appliances and on pickup trucks to move everything if they were, in fact, evicted. DeSoto realized that in this case, the difference between poverty and prosperity was simply owning the ground under your feet. A dwelling had to belong to you in order for you to work at improving it. So true freedom is yoked to responsibility. Many people complain about being yoked to a spouse or yoked to a heavy family responsibility or yoked to a mortgage. But if they were honest, they'd confess that taking on that yoke of responsibility was the best thing that ever happened to them. It forces us to use our abilities to the utmost. That's a paradox found in our lesson from the Gospels. Take my yoke upon you, says Jesus, and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. A yoke is a wooden frame used to harness oxen or horses. The two animals would be bound together. They would share the load equally as they plowed the fields. Jesus knew all about yokes. He spent many hours helping out in Joseph's carpenter shop. A good carpenter would custom make yokes, carefully measuring the animals because the yoke had to fit perfectly. And if it didn't, it would harm the animals. It could neither be too big nor too small. True freedom for the believer is being yoked to Christ. When the going gets rough, He is there with us, encouraging us, sharing the load, helping us to make it through. Take my yoke, Jesus told His followers. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. How can a yoke make us free?